Welcome, everyone. We're going to give it a few minutes before we get started to let the rest of our attendees trickle in here. So grab your coffee or your lunch and take a moment before we begin our program here. And I look forward to being in conversation with you today. Great. Well, I think we can get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar on the future of family philanthropy. For those of you I haven't had a chance to meet, my name is Nick Tedesco, and I'm the president and CEO of the National Center for Family Philanthropy. I'm excited to be in conversation with you today. I am celebrating my 1-year anniversary with NCFP this month. And in preparation for this webinar, I have been reflecting on what an extraordinary year it has been. I've also been reflecting on what led me to this role. And as many of you know, it's a desire to better resource philanthropic families. I've had the tremendous privilege to walk alongside donors for over a decade. And although there is so much good that is accomplished each and every day, one of the constant themes that continues to emerge is that there's an extraordinary amount of opportunity that is not yet fully realized in family philanthropy, an opportunity to truly position families for greatness. This year has in many ways reaffirmed the complexities of family philanthropy and the need for trusted communities and partners. And despite the challenges of the year, it's been one of opportunity and one of clarity. I've spent the last 12 months in deep conversation with many of you, with our community, to learn about what motivates you to do this work, to learn more about the challenges and opportunities present, especially in light of recent circumstances, and to better understand how we at NCFP can best support you and your families. And as we're nearing the end of this difficult and unprecedented year, I think we'd all acknowledge that the philanthropic sector is facing a moment of inflection. The triple crises of the pandemic, the movement for racial justice, and the economic recession have motivated donors to act, but have also spurred a real reckoning in the sector. Philanthropic families and institutions are thinking critically about equity, about power, about privilege, many for the first time. And we're excited to be in conversation with you today on this changing giving landscape. But before we begin the program, let me briefly share about our webinar technology. We want this webinar to be interactive, so please submit questions for the panelists. To ask a question, please use the question box on the current slide. When sending in a question, if you wish to remain anonymous, please indicate that. As a reminder, the webinar is being recorded, and a replay will be made available to all attendees. If you experience any technical issues, please reconnect to the technology or email jen.crino@ncfp.org. And as always, you're welcome to chat with us on Twitter about today's webinar using the hashtag NCFPWeb. Now on to our programming. In today's conversation, we're going to begin with a brief presentation that reflects on the 10 most notable trends that have emerged, mostly out of necessity from the challenges of the last year. These are trends that we have pulled from our conversations with our community, and we're really eager to hear if these are trends that are also resonating with you. Our panelist and NCFP board member, Kimberly Dasher Tripp, will then share her own reflections on these trends, and she'll lead us through a conversation on the future of the sector and how NCFP will continue to advance the work of the field. So what have we noticed? First, a couple of high-level thoughts. When donors were called to action in March, what we saw was that many responded without hesitation. This idea that donors were shedding old patterns of well-worn behavior and shifting towards more effective philanthropic approaches. And the question that now is on the top of everyone's mind is whether philanthropists will continue to carry forward these practices, particularly when the immediacy of the moment feels less intense, the urgency feels less intense. And family philanthropy and those who serve it must be ready to grapple with the questions and commit to making the necessary adjustments. And the first step in this is understanding the questions themselves, and we hope to bring those to life for you today. So again, we're going to start out now with a brief review of the 10 trends, and then we'll move into a deeper discussion about the implications of these shifts. And we'd love for you to share your thoughts in the chat while we're talking through the trends, and elevate any questions that you'd like us to review. So let's begin with the trends themselves. So the first trend that has emerged is one of rethinking risk. As we all know, donors have a very tenuous relationship with risk. Donors are often reluctant to deploy capital without a bit of a guaranteed outcome. And there's also historically been a lack of urgency in philanthropy. Time is in many ways a bit of an artificial construct. And the current moment, the past 6 to 9 months, are a reminder, a stark reminder of the long-held belief that philanthropic capital is risk capital. It's the necessary risk capital for innovation and for social impact. It's also clear that safe approaches are not always producing the impact we seek. And so what we've seen emerge is a shift that families are embracing, a shift to action. And we've seen many families give big, give now, and revisit their relationship to community needs, to risk, and to values in light of the crisis. The second trend that we have seen emerge is the trend of trust-based philanthropy. Trust-based practices certainly predate the events of 2020, but many more donors are beginning to embrace the tenets, in large part due to the need to deploy capital with urgency. When COVID emerged, donors just didn't have the time to conduct extensive due diligence, and nonprofits needed to be unencumbered in their work. They needed to get the work done. And this was all amplified by the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and many other Black lives. And so as a result, what we've seen is that donors are asking grantees what's needed. Donors are providing the support to accomplish the goals and objectives of the grantees. And they're doing that through a number of tools, the tools of multi-year grants, fewer reporting requirements, and a shift to general operating support, among many other practices. But what we're seeing overall is this idea that what we have observed by way of the trust-based practices are ones that we recognize are working and that need to be extended far beyond this moment. The next trend that we have seen is the trend of listening. There is a growing understanding that effective philanthropy must leverage the power and the voices of the end beneficiary. There must be a proximity to those beneficiaries. And so what we're seeing is families reflect on how they can be more closely connected to those who ultimately are the beneficiaries of the work. They're asking themselves how they can get more proximate to the work. So they're leveraging a number of practices, including participatory grant making, the introduction of independent board members, and a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly at the board and the staff level. But overall, what we're seeing is that donors are understanding that their work needs to be directly informed by those whom they seek to serve. The next trend is quite related. It's the trend of a racial equity lens. Prior to the events of this year, we saw that families would often look at racial equity as an issue area and not a cross-cutting lens. And what we're seeing is that families are increasingly reflecting on their own privilege, structural racism, systemic oppression. And we also are seeing that at the same time, criticisms are growing on the colonizing effects of wealth, and questions are being asked on how we can mitigate them. And so what we're seeing is donors that are beginning to reorganize and to think about how their giving can be done through an equity lens that's applicable to all of their issues and all of their approaches to their governance and their grant making practices, and moving from what was a focus on equity as an approach, as an issue, to now equity as an approach. The next trend that we're seeing is funding recovery and resiliency. These crises have had a broad sweeping effect on communities that will last far into the future. And many families have prioritized short-term immediate needs of communities, but are now grappling with the long-term solutions. And the events have also, at the same time, destabilized the nonprofit sector. And so what we're seeing is families acknowledge that to ensure the viability of existing grantees, they need to offer support that goes beyond this moment. And they also need to provide longer term support to communities to be able to ensure lasting recovery efforts. The next trend we're seeing is considering perpetuity. So this idea that donors are balancing community needs and the goals of the foundation. This very much is a moment when many families are revisiting the pace of their giving, and they're doing so in consideration with the needs of communities. The challenges, the opportunities of recent months have prompted a number of donors to accelerate their commitments and increase their payout and distributions, to continue to explore ultimately and advance the change that is so urgently needed. And what we're also seeing is that families are struggling in many ways to reconcile the urgency of the moment with a desire to build a family legacy. And this has produced a tension that quite honestly merits deeper thought. And families are also grappling with privilege, and the privilege that is inherent in accumulating assets in a time where there is such great need and despair in the world. And again, this is prompting families to think about, how do you reconcile that? The next trend is one on collaboration. There is very much a renewed interest in partnership and cross-sector collaboration. And we are seeing that donors are partnering with peer funders and leveraging intermediaries to scale impact, to respond quickly, and to build a strategy with joint expertise. And the urgency and enormity of the pandemic and the resulting economic crisis has highlighted the needs that go beyond what any individual donor can accomplish. And therefore, partnering in an informed and responsive manner has become something of a necessity in order to meet the moment. We've also seen a trend on family engagement and values. This moment has challenged families to reconsider their motivations for giving and ask themselves how philanthropy can carry forward their values and their desire for social impact. This notion of legacy itself is being challenged, and families are moving from a reflection of past efforts to, in many ways, a focus on current contributions and a relationship to impact. We're also seeing that family participation is changing, that families are seeing renewed interest and engagement, given the opportunity to be remote. And we're also seeing that many next generation family members are expressing an interest in family philanthropy, perhaps for the first time, because they're so inspired by this moment. And in many ways, it speaks to their skills and their ability to be able to think a bit differently about the solutions that might be brought forward around this moment. The next trend is one of transparency. The sector continues to face criticisms on wealth, privilege, and lack of transparency. And this criticism is leading many to ask a fundamental question about the relationship between family philanthropy, transparency, and privacy. And so what we're seeing donors do is shift practices to encourage better and open communication, to leverage information sharing, and to be much more intentional around their giving, knowing that they need to be more transparent and knowing that there is a scrutiny on the giving that is being done. Finally, the last trend that we are observing is one around advancing the concept of stewardship. The events of recent months have asked us all to pause, and donors are being asked to reflect on how they are managing funds earmarked for the public good. They're being asked to be more transparent. They're being asked to be more intentional, more effective, and more informed. And at the same time, philanthropy is challenging where the individual ends and where community begins. And they're asking many ways, donors are asking themselves, what is the responsibility of stewardship and how does that fit into the equation? And so it's prompted a number of questions for philanthropic families, questions such as, what is the role of philanthropic capital? And what is my obligation as a steward, and to whom? So we plan to explore these topics in much more depth, but first we wanted to take a poll to see what your thoughts are. So we're going to bring up a poll and wanted to ask you to choose one of these trends to see which one resonates with you the most. And we're going to give you a few minutes to read out. Great, looks like we've got family engagement and values in the lead here. Oh, family engagement and values has 22%, closely followed by trust-based philanthropy. And then it looks like risk, recovery and resiliency, racial equity are closely behind that. Thank you so much. So we will talk much more about this. And again, we love your questions, your thoughts. So please share them in the chat. We will continue to elevate these topics. But now I want to invite my partner and panelist in this effort, Kimberly Dasher Tripp, to join the discussion and turn on her webcam. Hey, Kimberly.
Hi, how are you doing?
Doing well. So Kimberly is the founder and principal of Strategy for Scale, where she works with donors and doers on philanthropic strategy. And we are really lucky to have Kimberly as an NCFP board member and to be in conversation with us today. So Kimberly, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Nick. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah,
I also thought it would be great to just talk about your very relaxing first year traveling around the country, doing not a whole lot, it's just a basic first year for any new CEO.
right, just settling into the role, nothing really on fire. Yeah,
Going to a lot of conferences. Yeah.
right, exactly. Well, best laid plans, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm excited for us to be in conversation today. I really want us to dig in on a couple of these trends. I want us to bring them to life. And I, of course, want to invite our community to elevate some questions to the both of us here. So first, I want to turn our attention to two of the trends. The idea of rethinking risk and collaboration. So these are two concepts that are incredibly linked. And we have seen a significant mindset shift in both of these, both risk and collaboration. So I want to start with a question to you, get some of your reflection on this. So how have you seen donors recalibrate their relationship to risk over the last year, and if at all? And are there broader changes in practices that you think speak to this trend that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I'm glad we're starting here. As you know, the donor community has been talking about risk and philanthropy's relationship to it for a long time. This question of what role does philanthropic capital play in the broader ecosystem? I'm thinking of things like Rob Reisch's book, Just Giving from 2018, arguing that philanthropy's primary role should be about taking on risk and innovation. But even if it's been on the table for a long time, it's really been more in an academic way. It hasn't been discussed as necessarily as urgent as it has been this year. So 2020 in that way has been a tipping point. And the simultaneous crises that we have faced have pretty interesting risk reward relationships because philanthropy could move faster and more nimbly than other kinds of dollars. And so what we see is that risk taking was valuable and there was a very quick return on that to donors. We also saw a lot of families using different vehicles to respond in different ways. So the conversation changed from which organizations meet our strategy and X or Y issue to what do we have at our disposal to act? And then we have all these structures, DAFs, foundations, C4s, C3s, funds, showing willingness to take risk, overall. And it also connects to impact investing. So meaning, what can our endowment do? What do our endowment's investments have to do with our values? How do we think of our capital as a continuum? That kind of thing. The other thing I'd say is that the relationship to risk is really complicated. So if we look at the issues that we have faced over the last 6 to 9 months, but also have faced for a very long time, we can find that they can be addressed in two different ways. So there's at the level of the community, most often manifesting in how do we fund or support direct service, or at the level of the system, meaning how do we fund or support policy, behavior change, foundational infrastructural change. And risk in each of those scenarios is different. So many of the trends you highlighted easily fit in the former, right? Might it be easier to take on risk in reaction to urgent community needs that we saw, whether it's economic uncertainty or educational inequities due to learning from home or COVID, even the wildfires. And perhaps in this type of work, it's easier for boards to see an intermediary like a fund or a community foundation as the most efficient and effective way to deploy capital to the communities that need it most. So I will be eager to see what happens in 2021 and beyond as philanthropy determines its relationship to risk at that system level. So as just as kind of vaccine talk is coming on, we're moving from that urgent moment to the system moment. Will the listening, the trust-based philanthropy trends continue? Will philanthropies continue to move faster, trusting communities who are most connected to the work? And will they take on more risk overall? Unrestricted grants, multi-year funding, coalitions, more diversity in board membership or in leadership. I'm not exactly sure what will happen, but it's interesting, which all leads me to the topic of collaboration, which you and I talk about frequently. And it's directly linked to risk. So like if you understand a willingness to trust somebody else to make choices on where to put your dollars, and ideally do that quickly, that is a form of acceptance of risk. The exploration of collaboration is not also new in 2020, but it also went on hyperdrive. And if we think about intermediaries being funds like 501c3s or donor advisories who can do a lot of things, community foundations, peer-to-peer donor collaboratives, we saw everybody shifting to respond to these efforts. Plus, we saw other intermediaries like the pledge platforms, banks, both DAFs and wealth advisories, and a whole host of consulting players working hard to accelerate collaboration. So I felt like it was this rallying cry of join us, let's go do this, versus a passive kind of let me share something with you and invite you to go back and discuss it with your board and see what happens, which is a different feeling than we have traditionally had. So what else have you seen? And do you think this is a real change in, for example, how we use intermediaries moving forward?
Yeah, so I'll touch on the intermediaries piece in a moment, but I want to underscore what you said about risk and what I mentioned in the introductory remarks. And yes, we will share the presentation and an associated primer that we have that outlines a lot of this in more depth. But when I reflect back on the last 6 to 9 months and I think about the relationship to risk, again, underscoring the point that a lot of families arrived at this newfound kind of embrace of risk out of necessity, right?
Mhm.
And you touched on this point, but this idea that in March people didn't have time to wait, right?
No.
Didn't have time to do the extensive due diligence, didn't have time to consider the outcomes or get guarantees on anything.
Right.
And so the idea here was we needed to spring into action. So we embraced risk out of a lack of other options.
Yeah.
And what we've seen out of that, hopefully, is some innovation that will carry forward the momentum of embracing risk. The idea that with this risk comes ultimately, hopefully, a high reward.
Right.
Without the risk, you get a bit of status quo. Status quo isn't working, right?
Right.
And so that's one thing that I wanted to underscore. But I do think around the intermediaries piece, as you point, it's very deeply related, right? And this has been a growing trend that predates kind of the events of 2020, the use of intermediaries, as we've seen donor collaboratives emerge, as we've seen funds emerge. But I think that there's something worth noting here that was really amplified over the last 6 to 9 months. And this is a sequence of behaviors by philanthropic families that I think is worth noting here. One is that increasingly what we're hearing is families have a desire to keep infrastructure lean, right?
Yeah.
Having worked at the Gates Foundation, I can tell you that there are many times that people will talk to me, particularly as I had served as a philanthropic advisor for a number of years, that have said, I don't want to, establish a structure that looks like the Gates Foundation. I
Yes.
want this to be lean. Yet at the same time, what you're hearing from these same families is a strong desire to make gifts that are informed and will accomplish a certain level of impact, right?
Right.
And in many ways, that desire for impact is a bit of a stalling mechanism, right?
Yeah.
It's what paralyzes individuals to act, right? Because there's no guarantee. And so, there is this desire for lean infrastructure, a desire for impact, but yet there isn't a recognition around the correlation between the two, right?
Mhm.
And what I would acknowledge here is that what we have seen, particularly in the last 6 to 9 months, is a recognition that without time, you can't really have the results that you seek to have, right? And so what you need to solve for is a different approach. And the different approach is outsourcing in many ways. Outsourcing, your work that you seek to do to partners that are equipped to do it, partners that are proximate, partners that are skilled and informed. And so this emergence of intermediaries alleviate the burden to build out the infrastructure and alleviate the burden to have that expertise. And the question now is will more people continue to extend out the use of intermediaries when there isn't this, you know, this limitation of time? Um,
Well, and it was interesting because the proliferation of funds that happened also meant that we needed to find such funds. So I think the very first thing families ask when they think, oh, there's all this urgency, as you recognize, there's this immediate acceptance of there may be somebody else who already understands this, that, as you say, may not be there in our status quo examples. But then it's this question of how do I find them? So technology, of course, I, the one in the Bay Area, I'm going to say this technology point, but technology starts to play a role here of how do you find them, the kind of matchmaking. And I just wanted to bring this up because I know NCFP leveraged technology to track intermediary efforts. And we've discussed the story of how this came about, which I think this audience might appreciate hearing. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I actually think it relates to Stephanie's point in the chat here about the collaboration piece has been huge, and she asked how folks will keep up with the options, assess fit and effectiveness, right? I mean, technology is one way to do that here. So, a couple of thoughts on this. And I'll share a little bit of a story that framed my thinking about the role of technology. And it really started with a call from one of our community members. It was March, and it was at the very early stages of the pandemic. And one of our community members, a very large philanthropic family with quite lean infrastructure, I might note,
Mhm.
called and said, we want to put significant money to work. We would like to actually support, getting PPE in the hands of those who need it.
Mhm.
And yet the family acknowledged their limitations to be able to find the opportunities to do that, right? So
Right.
again, following the framework that we just talked about here. And so they said, well, who can we turn to? What can we do to get dollars out the door, right?
Mhm.
And so we ended up calling the local community foundation and the local regional association to ask, have they seen some opportunities? And what we heard from them was that they were about to launch a fund,
Mhm.
and both of them were actually about to launch a fund. It turns out that that was the second and third fund that was being launched. And within a matter of weeks, we saw hundreds of these funds emerge.
Mhm.
And we decided to create a mechanism to track these funds, to provide some some lists of funds in partnership with Giving Compass. And what we have seen out of that is extraordinary. A lot of people leveraging these funds, a
Right.
lot of people that are really acknowledging that the people who are best equipped to do this work are the people that have been doing this work for quite some time, right?
Mhm.
And that there isn't a need to go out and meet new grantee partners, do the due diligence, and to get familiar with, with these partners whom may not have been previously familiar to you. And
Right.
so we saw people, again, out of necessity of time, shift and use these intermediaries, but it introduced to them by way of technology. And the question now that's on my mind is, again, does that continue? And
Mhm.
then how do we start to discern from the many different funds that are out there and will continue to emerge and the many different opportunities for donor collaboratives? But the idea that, we need to get more comfortable with collaborating. We need to get more comfortable with ceding control of decision making in order to move funds quickly. And that we need to be able to embrace as donors the concept of trust and trust in intermediaries, trust in partners, and to be able to think about how we can shift as philanthropic families to ultimately, again, put the dollars in the hands of those who are well equipped to steward those dollars. And that's a
Right.
key thing. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, this harkens back to all the trends we began with, because really these things are also linked. Um, and the question is, remains about the role of urgency in all of this. So, for example, in California, where I'm based, as we all know, there were horrible wildfires, and a whole bunch of funds popped up to support this recovery. So, donors in my neck of the woods were looking at COVID-related funds, racial justice-related funds, wildfire recovery-related funds. We saw a lot of very fast mobilization and use of intermediaries up and down the board. So that got me thinking: are we more comfortable with risk and the ease of intermediaries as reflections of our values and relationship to communities, etc., when it relates to an emergency? Or are we willing to adopt these practices moving forward? So, like, are we willing to fund Color of Change in Minneapolis in relation to George Floyd's death? But does that translate to an ongoing willingness to fund advocacy work for the Black community led by the Black community nationwide? Right? This really fundamentally asks the question at the end of 2020, which makes me so excited for 2021, of what of this will continue and how, which really, I think, leads fundamentally to this concept of advancing stewardship. So if these are dollars earmarked for public use, after all, how has this relationship to stewardship changed? And what would stand in the way of those changes?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of questions embedded there, right? One of the questions you're asking is, will this relationship to risk, this embracing of risk continue, and what would be a forcing mechanism to do that, right? One of the mechanisms I think is this opportunity for us as a community to reflect on our role as stewards. So I mentioned this in the introductory remarks here, but I do think, there's an acknowledgement here that the world, stood still for a moment, in the earlier part of this year, and then accelerated quite rapidly. But in this pause, right, there have been a lot of questions that have emerged and a lot of reframing of our respective thoughts about the way that we may have approached, our day-to-day lives, our philanthropy, the way that systems work or don't work, right? So one of the most exciting things for me about 2020 is this great pause, right, that has happened and has again prompted a number of questions and a moment for reflection. So one of these mechanisms that I think will hopefully accelerate this embrace of risk is this concept of a reflection of stewardship. This gentle reminder again that we are all stewards of the public trust. We're all managing funds that are earmarked for the public good. And that when we are putting dollars into structures like private foundations and donor advised funds, we are making an agreement that we are going to put dollars back into community, and we
Mhm,
are going to do it in an informed and effective manner, in a timely manner.
mhm.
And, you know, that is a concept that I think everyone is aware of, but isn't always necessarily, at the top of your mind as you are coming together as a family to make decisions.
Right.
And I think that it has come back to the top of everyone's mind, right? This idea of, again, what does it mean to be an effective steward? What is my role in this? And one of the roles is to be informed, and to listen to the communities that you seek to serve, to be informed by the experts on the issues that you seek to support, to be in conversation with your grantee partners, to make sure that these dollars are being put to work in an effective manner. And so what we are seeing, and I'm talking to philanthropic families each and every day that are asking the question of, how can we have these conversations in the boardroom? How can our family reflect on this? And it starts with a question. What are we currently doing as a
Mhm,
family, to be effective, to be informed? What are some of the hesitations that we have?
mhm,
And I mentioned in the introductory remarks that, one of the tensions here is, the tension between, the individual and community, and where the
mhm.
individual ends and where community begins, right? This idea of kind of, what interest do I bring to this work? And then ultimately, how am I responding to the needs of the moment, the needs of communities? And how do I reconcile both? Because both are important.
Right.
And just being able to name both of them, being able to recognize, that family philanthropy has a bit of a dual mission, right? There's the internal mission of family, and there's the external mission of social impact, and they need to be reconciled. They need to be discussed. Is something that's really important.
I would
So,
also,
yeah,
sorry, I was
please,
just
yeah.
gonna say, I would also add, so if you think of those as, family and community, there's also this question that we were talking about before of kind of systemic issues and community level, kind of the moment issues. And this will require, like, all four of those things require an openness. I saw some of the questions being asked about cross-sector collaboration. That also brings to mind, when you think about education,
Mhm.
it isn't just narrow, it is all these things, right? And so I feel like there's a question around, will this sense of stewardship also open philanthropies to being to be more expansive in their view of the systems level work, cross sector type of work, etc. You've talked to me before about this concept of kind of fluidity in philanthropy moving forward. So can you just talk a little bit about that, and kind of what you anticipate for the sector over the next few years?
Yeah, I've been kind of noodling on this idea of fluidity, as I've been reflecting on some of the shifts over the last kind of 6 to 9 months, and being asked the question of, what additional shifts do we think that we'll see, if we're going to kind of wear a bit of a futurist hat here. And I think that there's a couple of things that have come to mind for me, and I'd love to see if it resonates with you and with the audience here. And the first is that the overarching theme here that I would say, actually, before I talk about the first one, is that I think we're going to start to see a bit more fluidity in the way that philanthropy is practiced, kind of,
Mm,
across a number of fronts. And so what I would say is that I think that there, again, are a lot of questions that are being asked that are challenging the status quo, challenging the norms, the assumptions of longstanding practices, right? The question, before I get into some of the shifts that I think we'll see, the moments of fluidity, I would mention that, I think that this year has also, kind of brought a recognition that, again, some of these practices are actually just not serving the world, right?
mhm.
And I don't want to discount all the extraordinary work that family philanthropy community is doing,
Yeah.
and that has yielded. But I do think there are questions around, particularly around equity, right? And when you
Right.
look at kind of the systems that
And
underpin the
power.
issues. the questions of power, exactly. But the questions that we need to ask about why, our healthcare system isn't in better, positioning, why our education system isn't in better positioning, right? I mean, I think that all of this leads us to ask what we can be doing better. So I think we're going to see more fluidity on a couple of fronts. One is, I think we're going to see more fluidity around the deployment of capital. So
Okay.
this idea that there was a set point for private foundations traditionally, right? That's, the 5% minimum required distribution, acknowledging that many go above and beyond that. But I think what we're going to see is less rigidity to kind of the minimum required distribution and more fluidity to put capital to work when opportunities present themselves.
Mhm.
So this idea that there's going to be an ebb and a flow, right? I'm not saying that people are going to move to limited life entities, some might, but that there's an idea that very much 5% is the floor, it's not the ceiling, and that in a given year, in a given moment when opportunity arises, there's going to be an activation that will happen, and that there's going to be more comfort with that. And that's not going to necessarily kind of rattle the cage of the family and the institution in a way that it may have historically. And
Right.
this
So moving
idea,
from like arbitrary payout to responsive payout.
exactly. And this idea of intentionality, right? The
Yeah.
idea of all the decisions that you are making are done with intention. And the intention here is asking what are the needs and what are the opportunities. This goes right back to the question of stewardship, right? If I am stewarding funds to ultimately advance change in communities, and there is a moment in time where that change is, or opportunities to advance that change are presenting themselves,
Hmm.
then as a good steward, is it up to me to actually seize that opportunity, even if it
Right.
goes beyond what I'm thinking historically the construct of my distribution looks like, right?
Or outside of your issue areas.
Exactly, or outside of your issue areas, right? So I do think the first thing here of the kind of the shift that we might see around fluidity is the deploying of capital. I think the second one is this idea that families are moving beyond kind of one structure, one tool, one construct,
Yes. I'm
right?
glad you're talking about this. Yes.
Yeah. So the idea that what we're seeing is a lot of families that are moving beyond, the traditional vehicle, the private foundation, or even the traditional use of one vehicle, and are
Hmm.
looking at how they can incorporate multiple vehicles and how they can look at how each of these vehicles plays a role in a bit of a portfolio approach to accomplish the totality of their objectives, right? So the idea that traditional grant making out of a private foundation structure is one really incredibly powerful tool. But what if we want to look at, aligning our capital in other ways and activating it, by way of impact investments? What if we want to think about advocacy? What if we want to look at collaboration? And so what we're seeing is families, that are now incorporating, you know, donor advised funds, C4 entities, LLC structures that actually organize all of their entities, and allow more fluidity around things like impact investing. And so, what we're seeing is, again, kind of a bit more openness to using a portfolio of vehicles to be able to meet your needs, knowing that not one in particular is probably going to solve for everything that you want to accomplish.
Well, and related to this, Nick, we will probably, based on what we're seeing now, see more products also, more innovation there on the endowment management side. So it's, as you were saying, impact investing. That's partly about, are there things that we can specifically invest in? Maybe, certain businesses or kind of equity type opportunities. But you can also imagine these two worlds that have previously been pretty distant from each other, families finding themselves, if we're even increasing from our 5% to 7 or 8%, 93% is sitting over here in this endowment. And what is that endowment doing? Which is directly related to this question or to this idea of fluidity, moving beyond traditional vehicles. So it's not just the giving, but also the investing too, that carries through the family values, the response to the urgency, etc.
Right.
Um, yeah,
Exactly. And I,
yeah,
I think it all again comes back to the idea of stewardship, right? And intentionality.
yeah.
The idea of let's ask ourselves, and re-ask ourselves in many ways, because many families have undergone these reflections, but let's ask ourselves some questions around, what we ultimately seek to accomplish and what is going to get us there, right? What are the
Mhm.
tools that are going to think about how we are going to be best equipped to do this? Um, so one other shift that I'll mention here around the fluidity element is this idea of decision-making frameworks. So we
Mhm.
mentioned family engagement as a bit of a trend. It's been quite fascinating to see how families are rethinking the way that they're coming together to make decisions in light
Mhm.
of the recent year. And I think that what we're going to see is we're going to see much more fluidity around how families continue to organize themselves, where historically there has been a bit of a vertical construct of decision making,
Right.
oftentimes by generation, with deference to the generation that is the eldest. I think that what we're starting to see is a shift in that to more of a horizontal construct, where there's less hierarchy, where there's more partnership, where the next generation is beginning to engage in a deep and an informed way. And in many ways, we're seeing the next generation challenge some of the constructs that have existed in the family
Yes.
decision-making frameworks. And I think that there's a real healthy way to do this, to have these conversations and to reorient the relationships of the family members as professionals, as equals in the work that they do. And so, in
Zoom,
part,
the great equalizer, right?
exactly. And I think technology is playing a huge role in this, as we talked
Yeah.
about, right? The
Yes.
fact that, Uncle Joe, who's historically never been part of these conversations, can zoom into a board meeting and
Exactly.
actually now express his opinion. But so can your son or daughter who maybe has been busy with their professional lives or their family and hasn't
Right.
had the opportunity to take 3 days out or 5 days out of their lives to do this work, but are moved and affected by what they need to do. And so
Absolutely.
I
With
think we're
with
going to
their
see.
kids walking in the background, right?
Right,
Exactly.
exactly.
Yes.
So I think we're gonna
Well,
see more of an interesting construct with family engagement.
so it sounds this sounds exciting, this world you're painting. um, and I think I agree with you that the broader ecosystem is changing a lot. And that would only increase with the fluidity that you describe if done right and with the right moral grounding for the right with the right purposes, back to the stewardship point. But we also have to be realistic about the reckoning that we've witnessed, and there have been harsh words said about philanthropy over this period of time also. So earlier on we were talking about moving from the theoretical into practice, and we've seen some of this in practice. But can you be more specific about what would be required to really make this change, like
Yeah, I
practically?
think that there's two parts to this. So one is the psychological, and one is the practical, right? So I think the psychological first is, again, it's the awareness. The first step of this is asking yourselves again, kind of what is your role, your responsibility, kind of what potentially are some of the anxieties that might be standing in the way of making
Mhm.
shifts. I do think, having a conversation at the family level, to ask kind of, you know, how might we shift in this moment, right? Or
Mhm.
not, right? Acknowledging all that we've done before. And of what does this moment mean for us, for our family philanthropy, and for me individually as a participant on this? What are some of my hesitations on, changes that we might need to embrace given some of the conversations that are happening at the public level? What does it mean for us privately as a family? And how can we make a bit of a shift to think about what's needed and where our opportunity lies? And I think some of this is actually naming some of the trends, right? So
Mhm.
taking these 10 trends and having a conversation, at a board meeting, asking kind of how they are, incorporated into our practice as a family, what we might want to move towards in a more effective and informed manner. and
Mhm.
what truly some of our hesitations are towards some of these.
Mhm.
And I think that that is one of the first things that we need to do, is we need to ask ourselves kind of where are we in this changing ecosystem and what are some of our hesitations on this. Um, and the second is practical. The second is to think about how you as a family can ultimately continue to advance in your practice. And some of that means thinking about, again, how you can make decisions in a more kind of informed manner.
Mhm.
So that might mean inviting in an independent board member. It
Mhm.
might mean talking to other families that are doing this work. It might mean bringing in consultants to think through some of the shifts that you need to make. Um, and it might mean looking past some of the approaches that you've taken historically into thinking about, the way that you can adopt a broader lens on the change that's needed.
Right.
And again, move towards a bit more fluidity in how you're thinking about the issues and the approaches.
Um, I know some of this is going on in the chat, but this question of kind of failure and risk are linked. Um, and I, in my practice, certainly talk to families about fear and fear of failure, which is linked to this psychological part that you were just discussing. Um, what do you think this whole experience in the past 6 to 9 months has meant about fear and our relationship to um, some of these different relationships to risk?
Yeah, I mean, I think that fear is a huge barrier. It's a barrier in our everyday lives. It's a barrier in our philanthropic practices. The fear of failure, the fear of not getting it exactly right. Um, the fear of letting go of control.
Mhm.
There is a lot of fear that I think presents itself. And I think that, the last 6 to 9 months have actually, necessitated us letting go of some of that fear, right?
Mhm.
Because we've acknowledged what we needed to do and we've not let fear stand in the way. And so, what I'm holding is that there was a pretty seismic shift that happened over the last 6 to 9 months. um, and can we continue to carry that forward? Can we continue to acknowledge fear, name fear, and work kind of around and with fear, and be comfortable with being uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
Because the only way that I think we're really going to be able to change, you know, uh, and continue to make change. I mean, a lot of change has been manifesting, but continue to advance change, is to again embrace these risks, is to think about our role as steward, is to shift some of our practices. It's going to feel uncomfortable, right? And what I'm hoping the last year has taught us is that just because it feels uncomfortable hasn't necessarily meant that it's not producing positive results, right? In fact, the opposite.
Mhm.
And so if we can get again comfortable with being uncomfortable, then I think what we'll find is that we are more responsive as a sector, we're more informed as a sector, we're more willing to take action.
Yeah.
And letting go of that fear is a critical first step.
Um, as you were talking, one of the things I was thinking about is uh, our relationship of grant making to the issues that we are working on. What I mean by that is, um, if we think about fear of failure, um, kind of a reaction to that is to fund small. It's to fund things that you can actually predict an outcome 1, 2, 3 years from now, which winds up being, as I say, quite small in the face of what we're talking about. So economic inequality or uncertainty, as you were saying, the healthcare system that is not serving everyone, and then et cetera, et cetera. But then when we think of things like climate change that have all of these components, healthcare, justice, sustainability, equality, gosh, migration, you name it, it starts to get quite big. And so the question is, can some of the experience of this summer in, for example, funding advocacy work. You cannot directly say as a measurement tactic, my dollars led to X outcome. It contributed, but it's not attributable to you. Can some of those practices start to help families or teach families, give them the direct experience to say for something, say like ongoing racial equity within all the systems, education, healthcare, whatever, or climate that cross cuts. Can we start to see a comfort with both contribution style giving versus this kind of more directly attributable to us? But also, this brings back this question of collaboration and the rise of intermediaries, right? So if we think as a family as having a portfolio, some of that can be this direct linkage work, and some of it can be on these, systemic levels. And one way, if your family is experiencing hesitancy to take on all of that risk, working collectively inherently feels less risky than simply doing things alone. So the rise of all these intermediaries and the sharing of them, and as you said, the technology that gets us to find them, the air traffic control, if you will, to all of that, really, really helps. So just before we head to questions in a second here, but like what can donors continue to do to meet the needs of this moment?
Yeah, I mean, some of this I think we've elevated throughout the conversation and we'll continue to elevate, but a couple of things. I mean, one is reflect on, where you are as a family who gives, and have the conversation around motivations and values. And many of you have had that conversation, but this is a time to have it again, right? Spend, a few minutes, a few hours, if you can, in a family dialogue to really think about kind of, let's revisit why we're doing this work and what we want to see out of it, both near and long term, right? And let's again think about that from a dual lens. Let's think about kind of what are the motivations that drive us to do this work from the internal family perspective lens, right? Is it to continue to engage the family and keep the family together? Is it to promote certain values within the family? But ask yourselves what the motivation is from the internal family lens and from the external social impact lens. And ask yourselves, has that changed, kind of knowing what we know, observing what we have observed over the last 9 months? And if the answer to that is no, that it's a simple affirmation of everything we've been doing, that's clarity. If the answer is it subtly is going to shift or it is going to exponentially shift, that too is clarity. But having that conversation is necessary. So, what I would encourage everyone to do is set aside time in the next board meeting if you're a private foundation, or around the table during the holidays to say, let's revisit why we're doing this. Philanthropy is a conscious choice.
Right.
And it is a choice that you have to keep making over and over and over again. And the motivations change over time, and it's okay. So the first is really to reflect on those motivations and values. The second is to reflect on the practices. So what practices have you employed as a family that are serving you well, that are serving the communities well, and what aren't? And how can you shift knowing what's been elevated in the last year, right? The idea that new tools have emerged, right? The idea that new practices have emerged, and the idea that there is a greater understanding of systemic inequality that is undergirding all of these issues that we all seek to support.
Yep.
And an awareness that systems is an important focus. And so again, asking yourself kind of about the practices themselves and how you might make a shift or not. The other thing I would mention is, again, going back to what we said about fear, ask yourself, is there anything standing in the way for us? Are there some hesitations for us? And is that a hesitation to adopt a different approach? Is it a hesitation to make a shift? Is it a hesitation to even have the conversation itself, right? And just name it.
Yep.
And then again, really think about your role as a steward. And, The thing that I would say that underscores all of this is that there is a community here of people that are willing to share ideas and share opportunities and to partner and to leverage that community to be able to think about what you need to do to think about the next 10, 20, or 200 years of your family philanthropy.
Um, I'm getting some questions in, so this is going to be good. Before you go off of that topic, how are families grappling with privilege? As are there any useful strategies? I'm just thinking as you're saying, let's have these family conversations, the next board meeting around the the table over Zoom. Have you seen any useful strategies or steps families take with younger generations? Yeah, this question of privilege is a big one. And I just want to put a fine point on it. If we think about, and this is domestic international giving, but so much of the conversation we're having around risk or around kind of leaning into trust-based practices, et cetera, also require that we might have to abandon some of the instinct in philanthropy to say, before I do anything, I need to be completely well informed on this issue. It's, I need to spend a long time getting up to speed, versus leaning on that expertise of somebody who might be very proximate to the issue that is related to privilege, that you can take all that time, or that you can determine that. So walk me through that, and specifically generationally too, since I know that's sometimes different.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated topic, right? So I
Yeah.
think the first tactic that I've seen that I think is successful but takes, some nuance here is depersonalizing. Some of the critiques of philanthropy. That there is an acknowledgement of privilege that I think each and every one of us need to own. And to be able to acknowledge that we are all in privileged positions is the first step. And to be able to then kind of think about what you do with that privilege, and think about ultimately how you're going to adjust some of your practices in light of the awareness that we've all had over the last 6 to 9 months of the circumstances that need to change.
Mm-hmm.
And so where I've kind of seen this work really well is where families have reflected on their history, and reflected on having a really open dialogue around the history of the wealth creation, the history of the position of privilege that they're in, and ask themselves, okay, we acknowledge the position of privilege. We acknowledge the history of this wealth creation. But the question now is very much a forward-looking one of what are we going to do with that privilege? And what are we going to do to continue to serve the world, right? However we kind of define our focus. And to be able to have an open dialogue around that, I think is really critical. Some of the practical tools, circulating an article or reading a book, certainly Decolonizing Wealth is a really, important read. But having some discussions around that, I acknowledge that this is a really complicated thing to do, and that there is a lot of emotion that is just, embedded in these conversations. But there's ways to do it that talk about this from both the criticisms that are emerging on wealth holders and kind of then talking about it from the perspective of, what are we going to do as a family of a position of privilege?
Well, and connected to this, Sergio from the audience was saying, what are some of the foreseeable governance changes in philanthropy, especially as rising generations are more empowered? So linked to what you're just saying, are there kind of governance things that we can be thinking about related to what you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think bringing in some independent, directors, people that can, both facilitate conversations from a place that is kind of adjacent to but connected to the family, is important. And we've seen that work well with families, particularly cross generations, where there is an independent board member or several independent board members who are part of that conversation, the neutral observer, right?
Mhm.
To be able to think about, facilitating a conversation, and also asking the family some hard questions, right? I mean, it's very difficult for, you know, um, for the second generation to be asking the first questions of power and privilege, but it's a
Yeah.
lot easier, or to ask themselves that, right? For one sibling to ask that of another, or for the children to ask it of their parents. But it's quite another for an independent board member who you've invited into this work to ask the question of the family. And it's not going to have these ripple effects of potentially damaging family relationships, and pitting family member against family member. But there's a way to have some independent voices that ultimately can arbitrate that conversation.
Right. And even I noticed some of our audience members here noting that there's restrictions in who can be board members, but even consultants or guests invited to board meetings can play that same role. You mentioned a book plus a facilitator may seem like a silly thing, but if you do that intentionally for an hour, 90 minutes, you would be surprised. Well, but many would be surprised at how much can come out of that and how much can be said simply by having somebody else there to facilitate some of these conversations. And I think that we as a sector have done a great job on values, really kind of self-reflection, but it's not always values placed in the world. Who are we, and what does that privilege or that power mean to the world? It's a little bit more self-reflective historically. I just want to say to the audience, there have been
Yeah.
lots and lots of questions on spend down, strategic lifespan. Nick, can you just really quickly, I know there was an excellent
Yeah, no,
webinar and a really great resource being done by a man who is in the audience today. So can you just say very quickly, if folks are interested, where they can find that?
yeah, so absolutely. And then I've got a great
And
question
maybe
for
describe the
you.
research that was done this year.
Yep. And then I've got some questions for you as well. So Tony Macklin, who's part of the audience here, has done some great research on the idea of payout. And we authored a publication that we can paste into the chat here, around, reflecting on how you balance payout with the desire for permanence, and purpose. And there is a webinar that is associated with that. It's all found on ncfp.org. But we'll also paste in some links here, and we can put it in the resources as well. But it's a great publication and related webinar that talks about, both individuals that have gone beyond kind of, the 5% in a given year like this, but also providing some data of what it means, to go beyond. Does it actually compromise perpetuity? It turns out it doesn't, right?
Right.
And there's some great data around that. And so there's a lot of resources that we can share here on that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yes. One of the questions for you that came in, is one that I know that you know quite well, but the idea of, where do good stewards start? How does a family foundation start? What does planning look like as you are looking to 2021? How does one get started?
I love this question, as you well know, because just because you've come into wealth and have been probably most likely through a tax or legal experience, have a foundation, doesn't mean that you necessarily um, spent your life trying to become a professional philanthropist. So there's this disconnect in many ways where I always like to say, in very few parts of the world does structure come before strategy. And this is one of those spaces where it often does. People are given a structure and then need to develop a strategy. We would most likely always want to go the other way around, given that that is the way that it is, because whether tax or wealth events or inheritances create these vehicles, it's important to be intentional about the vehicles. So the way that I always think about getting started, there are kind of two ways or two important parts of this. Is one is be intentional and facilitate it, whether that's somebody that you can work with within your family or someone that you know who is experienced. I think it is a misnomer that philanthropy is easy and that it's just about finding whatever your heart desires. it's harder than that if you would like it to be rigorous and have impact. And so therefore, facilitating out, what are we trying to do? Why are we trying to do it? Where is that best placed? And understanding some best practices and some trade-offs. For example, those of us who've done all this programmatic work for a really long time take it for granted that you don't sprinkle the ocean. You don't give, $5,000 grants to many, many grantees, because that will just limit impact. But that's not always well known. And so there's some just basic best practices to work on. And then the second part is networks. It's 100% of the reason that I'm on the board here, because I see this expectation that you get started with this structure. You're told every philanthropist is unique and you should follow your heart. What on earth is off the table? How on earth do you make decisions within that framework? It's not clear. And there are people who have done it before you. There's myriad resources for learning. And if we continue to put the onus on the individual or the family to think that they need to invent this themselves, we're doing the entire sector a disservice. So I would encourage new families both to seek some facilitation, whether that's within the family or external too, so that you're intentional about it. And second, join some networks, NCFP being a great one, but learn from peers.
Yeah. That's great. We've got only a couple minutes left. So,
well, in that case, let me do this. Let me just pivot us for a second. What does all of this mean for NCFP, Nick? So given your perch, how do you think about holding yourself accountable, not you, but NCFP accountable to these behavior changes?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm really excited to get thoughts from the community, from each of you about what we can be doing. But there are some commitments that we've made to ourselves at the board and the staff level that I'm excited to share with the community. And we will be sharing much more next year on this. But a couple of things. There are some shifts that we're making as the rest of the world is making its shifts. The first is that we are making a shift to advance a vision of effective family philanthropy. And that is directly born out of what we have been hearing from the community over the last 6 to 9 months and over the last 20 plus years. So the idea that we are going to be elevating practices and stories of effective family philanthropy is going to be a noticeable shift. One of the things that we're going to be doing is we're also going to be moving beyond kind of our traditional focus on family governance. We will still have a deep focus on governance and decision-making framework, but we are now going to talk about the totality of the life cycle of family philanthropy, again, with an eye and orientation towards effectiveness, acknowledging that every family is unique in their journey, but there are shared points of inflection. Mm-hmm. And at these points of inflection, there are questions that each family needs to ask themselves, and that there are resources that each family can leverage and community that can support them. And we are going to be building a model here where we take you through each of the points of inflection, and we provide those resources and those questions. We're going to be moving towards a hub model. And what that means is that we are going to be the place, as we have, for family philanthropy to come and to orient themselves towards the resources that the sector has to bring to make available for families. And by way of partnerships, we are going to bring those resources into the NCFP community. And the goal here is that as a family who gives, you come to NCFP and you're able then to access what the sector has to offer by way of trainings and skill building sessions and opportunities and cohorts of learning. And so the last shift that we're making is we're going to be building out more programs. We're going to be doing the work of providing opportunities to dig deeper into skills and practices and doing it in smaller community cohorts. And so these are some of the early shifts, but we'll talk much more in depth about that next year.
Wonderful. Well, I, for one, hope that the listening tour is not over and that we can do this again this time next year and see what else is happening. Thank you very much for all of everything that you've shared. It's been great.
Yeah, and I want to thank you, Kim. This has been a really interesting conversation that we could go on for hours with.
Always.
But really want to thank you for your thoughts and reflections. Want to thank you for your leadership on the board. And I want to thank all of you in our community for being here today. Before we sign off, a few quick announcements about upcoming programs. So we're pleased to announce our Fundamentals in Family Philanthropy webinar series. So this is a new series for us, and the monthly webinars are now going to be, in part, Fundamentals of Family Philanthropy. And it is going to be a series that equips giving families with the latest information on evergreen topics. The topics that we talked about that align to the donor life cycle. And our first webinar is Defining and Translating Motivations and Values. It'll be held Thursday, January 14th from 12 to 1:15 p.m. And in this conversation, in the webinar in January, we will explore how to facilitate conversations on motivations for giving, strategies for translating shared values into action, and how to successfully carry forward these values across generations. And these fundamentals are not just for people new to family philanthropy, but for people that have been doing it for years and generations. And then we will move forward through the year with 11 other conversations on the fundamentals of family philanthropy. So check out our website for more information. We're also pleased to offer peer networks, and we're going to be launching a few new peer networks in the new year, including a board chair peer network. And so please contact Katie Scott at katie.scott@ncfp.org to learn more. And finally, don't forget to connect with us on social media. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and please join us on January 14th, and I hope you all have safe and happy holidays. Thank you all so much. Take care.